So go ahead and look at the maps. The first one, we are looking at, you know, the major things going on around the site. This is the map. I believe the next one, no, okay. So what kind of things do you need to think about with these variables going on? You've got a major highway out front. What kind of impacts would be there? You've got an industrial business machining company. What could impact you there? What about run-on from an auto storage yard and a connection to the wetlands? What do you need to think about? What kind of BMPs do you need to think about in addressing these situations? So let's look at the run-on from the auto storage yard. They could potentially have all sorts of automotive fluids. So maybe putting a berm, a cement berm along the backside of your business to keep run-on from coming onto it and diverting it, or keeping it on the auto storage yard side. What about the wetlands next door? One of the things that when we developed this map, there's a direct connection here. This is the property line or a fence, but it can sometimes get underneath into the wetland with heavy storms. So putting in some kind of berm around this area so it's diverted and goes into the storm drain is what you want to think about. Major highway, what kind of things happen out there that could get onto your property?
Oil spillage.
Mm-hmm. Anything else?
Said from the highway?
Yes.
From the highway, you're going to get zinc from the tires. You're going to get
Brakes.
Yeah, brake dust. There's a bunch of things from the highway.
Okay. So as you think about that, we'll talk about it later as to the BMPs, but that's great. And then what about the industrial business, the machining company?
Filings, metal filings, whatever they're machining, you're going to get whatever type of metal they're using or machining. It's going to be dust particles.
Okay.
I always just do like voluntary.
I didn't quite.
You're working the hour.
Okay. Okay, so let's look at the next slide. On this one, you wanted to note distances on the property, distance from the building, etc. What else would go on here? Here's kind of a, so what other things could you note on the slide that might be appropriate for distance and acreage and things like that? I saw something in the chat and I.
In the chat, they said label property lines.
Okay, good. Yeah, if you can watch that for me, Lori, I'd appreciate it. Anything else? How about a north, south, east, west, perhaps? So you have an orientation. Okay. Let's look at the next one. Oops. This one has uniquely naming catch basins and showing the general direction of the stormwater flow. So we've uniquely named all the basins. One of the reasons why you want to do that is say A and B get really hit hard with a lot of sediment because maybe the trees from the wetlands and things like that, leaves, needles, etc., soil, maybe, especially if maybe this is your entrance here for big trucks, they may bring in a lot of dirt and stuff from the main road as well, depending. So you want to be able to say, we need more extensive cleaning in A and B and maybe C. Anything else that you might think of putting on this map? Okay, let's go on to the next. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Any kind of errors for run-on water and also showing potential water draining into the wetlands?
Sure, yeah, that's great. That's great. This was one of the things. Sorry?
And someone said sampling points.
Okay, okay, good. Let's go on to the next one. So on this map, we do have the sampling locations and sheet flow and runoff and areas of concern and the storm drain flow. So something like this. I have the storage area circled, the loading dock circled, and the fueling station circled as areas of concern. The reason being that when you have a loading dock, there's a potential for spills when you have loading and unloading and forklifts and trucks. Storage area, you might have bins and things like that that could spill, as well as, of course, the fuel station. You've got your sampling locations. The reason why 3 is circled is initially that is one area that there is runoff, which is on another slide. And so either you have to sample there or figure out how to keep it on site so it's not going off site. Down below, you've got the arrow of run-on materials from the other business. Anything else? Oh, and the storm line drains showing direction of flow. Anything else you guys can think of? Okay. And then here, show where it leaves the property and where it infiltrates. And this shows where it's leaving the property, where it's infiltrating. And what I'd love to do in this next slide is kind of talk about things that are going on your property and how maybe this mapping exercise has helped you think about your own property and what's going on this map and the types of actions you would take to minimize the effects of what's going on.
And there's someone who asked what the question mark was on the previous map.
I'm not seeing it.
Maybe it was the one before.
Okay. Oh, so this could be an area of runoff or run on from the other business.
I had a question on that slide where you just talked about infiltration.
Okay.
I was just curious, what do you mean by infiltration?
Okay.
And how is that different from run-on?
Okay. So generally, infiltration is when you have some soil or vegetation that water goes into and doesn't flow out of. So it allows it to go into the ground or infiltrate. Whereas if it's leaving the property or, so for example, we had the auto storage yard back here. If you have, maybe this is all cement, so it's permeable pavement or impermeable pavement, excuse me. And so it has easier access to get onto your site, okay? And then here, it would be flowing into a wetland, so a water body. And it's leaving your property, which is not a good thing because it's impacting next door. Does that make sense?
Sorry, I muted myself again. So would this be applicable for any landscaping on the property and or just where it ends up going from the areas that it infiltrates into and exits out to wetlands? Or I guess I'm still a little bit lost as far as is it just when it's raining it absorbs in the ground and that's where it infiltrates? And how is that related to
That's looking at like the HR
concerns,
training.
the stormwater concerns?
There's a lot of.
Wetlands. It is more likely to end up in the water over here. Okay. And in here, it's going to be soil that will absorb it. So if there's a direct connection from groundwater to the local water body, which is a wetland on that side over here, that would be of concern, and it would be leaving your property as well. If the infiltration, these places would absorb water, and you've also got some storm drains pretty close by that would take a lot of that off, then there's not as big an issue. On this, you've got a storm line going off, right? And then this is kind of an exposed area where you have runoff. And so you need to think about how your stormwater impacts the neighbors and or local water bodies. And unfortunately, the neighbors, if they don't have a permit, they don't have to think about that.
So if I'm just looking at the hedges in the back that border between the junkyard and this property,
Mm-hmm.
concern would be that the junkyard, or maybe my business somehow had some contaminants in the ground or on the ground, and then the
Mm-hmm.
water would leach that into the ground, and then it could, instead of filtering it out through the stormwater system.
So you're talking here?
Yeah, just as an example.
Yeah.
Is that the thought process there?
Potentially. Lori, did you have something to say?
Yes, I did, but that wasn't me. There's
Okay.
just a really informative comment. There's a comment that recommends showing a pavement edge definition would help clarify that.
And that's a BMP that you guys should think about, is making sure that there is pavement. A lot of areas where there's industrial activity, it's one business connected to another business, connected to another business. And often it's solid pavement between. So you have to delineate the edges of your property to maintain what you create or is created on your site versus what can come on from another property. You need to, so like, yes, this area down here could help alleviate the run-on. However, there's access here and it could run on further. You don't want to also start absorbing a lot of their chemical runoff, you know, like automotive fluids and things. And that, because that could impact your stormwater over time.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So let's take a look at the big map and see what's going on. I'll kind of maybe point out some things. You guys tell me what you think. And also if there's anything that is, as you've gone through this exercise, how you can apply it to your own site that you might not have thought otherwise. So let's start. We've talked a bit about the run-on down here and the runoff down here. You got a bunch of stored drums. They may or may not have any material in them, but they are made of metal. So what are some things you guys can do to address that?
Put it in a containment.
Okay.
Put a covering on.
Yep. Okay,
Covered
good.
containment.
Covered. Yep. Good. All right. How about these tires over here? These used tires.
I'll move
Probably
them
should
away
be in
from that.
Covered trailer or something.
Okay. A trailer. Yeah, that's a good idea. Somehow get rid of them so they're not leaching. Yeah, get rid of them, Barb. Thank you. Yep. Okay. Yeah, I mean, oftentimes I walk onto business sites and I see this accumulation of materials, and it's not necessary because you haven't used it for 10 years or however long. And so just getting rid of things that you don't need on is a good thing. And getting a trailer, especially if you do it on a regular basis, maybe this is a site that deals with tires, who knows? putting them in a trailer so they're covered would be a good way to go. Okay, so you got a couple unpaved areas here. What would you do with that?
Put curbs around them for one.
Okay. Perhaps maybe you'd want to pave it so that it's not, you know, putting dust or, you know, gravel dust or soil onto the rest of your pavement, which would cause you problems with your stormwater sampling. And something similar with the alligator, permeable pavement. Okay, permeable pavement. Now you might want to think about the permeable pavement if you are this close to the wetland. Okay. But this seems like a good idea to put on there. And I saw a bunch of comments. Lori, can you read them?
I saw permeable pavement, employee parking not required, stormwater sample, then to a plan to maintain it. Those were the comments.
Plan to maintain it. Okay, good, good. And so when we kind of established this, one of the things we were talking about is perhaps making this staff parking so it's not an issue. But if you've got things going on, like the storage of these metal bars or pipes or whatever they are, then this is going to be impacting your stormwater sampling. So what would you do about these? How would you address this? Is this the appropriate place to store them? Or if you have to use that space, what do you do to eliminate potential for impact on your stormwater? Cover it, cover them, put on pallets. Okay, good. Okay, oh, they should not be on the pavement. Okay. Okay, good. And I think finally the, okay, so you got alligator pavement, you'd probably want to do the same thing either. Now, one of the things about using permeable pavement, sometimes it doesn't stand up to a lot of truck traffic. So you might consider perhaps, because this is all just cars, doing this section in permeable pavement and doing a more impermeable pavement here, just because it will withstand a lot of truck traffic. WSU and Washington Stormwater Center are doing a really interesting project. Yep, petroleum will eat up the permeable pavement. So one of the things that WSU Washington Stormwater Center is doing is working with Boeing and using carbon fiber to see if they can't create a more permeable pavement that has more a stronger structure that will allow truck traffic. So that's in the process of being looked at, and hopefully we'll soon have some kind of documentation as to how well that withstands heavy weight and a lot of traffic. So do you have any information on that, Lisa or Lori?
I'll take the question. So yes, we worked with the Boeing Corporation, Boeing Company, to install some of that carbon fiber impregnated permeable pavement in a place in Tacoma called the Idea School. And although there's not a lot of big truck traffic, it is a live installation. So there is traffic going over that. And we're taking both core samples, and I think, now that I say that, we may not be, but we are doing some runoff treatment of their runoff analysis of that, and also some strength testing as well. So that will be a paper coming out probably, I'm going to say in the next year or so. We are also running toxicity tests on that material to see if there's something in the carbon fiber that could possibly increase the toxicity. So that will be a paper coming out as well.
Okay. Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, no problem.
I look forward to hearing about the results. So one of the things that, like the major highway and the industrial business machining company situation, because they could kick up dirt and dust that have zinc in them, it's probably a really good idea to make sure that you sweep on a regular basis, because you probably will be impacted by air deposition on your property. Unfortunately, despite the fact that it's not produced by you, you still have to deal with wetlands on your property. So the other thing we've got is a building and roofs that are galvanized. Have any of you dealt with getting your buildings or fences or anything like that painted to help with zinc?
I'm sorry, painted with zinc? This is Lisa. Can you clarify that?
No, painted to address zinc.
Okay.
The other thing I wanted to ask is, you guys, as you were going through this exercise, how did you apply it to your own facility? Did it make you think about things that are going on your site that you might not have thought of otherwise?
Yes, actually, I'm going to jump in here. Tim Reed has a question in the, he was thinking about his own facility, and he said that the tires in the picture is what brought that to his mind. So his question is, how does one get rid of excessive 5-gallon buckets of paint? It sounds like you have quite a lot of big gallons of paint that the previous owner left. And so he says he's gotten rid of everything except that paint. So I don't know what jurisdiction he is in, but he may be able to get to a moderate risk waste facility. It's usually at the county usually has those. I know here in Thurston County, we have a facility that that will take some of those materials. I guess it depends on what kind of paint it is and whether or not it's how it's packaged. So I can't answer that entirely, but Tim, if you want to, let's see, how can we do this? And how can we have him, how can we follow up with him? Do we have his contact information?
Yeah, I do. Just a real quick, I know that at least in, it depends on what type of paint. If it's latex versus oil-based. Because oil-based is flammable, you normally hazardous materials locations will accept that. If it's latex, it really depends on the where you're located. I know that King County will not take it, but Snohomish County will, but you have to pay for it. The other thing is that there are places, if the paint is good still, places like Habitat for Humanity, if in large quantity, larger, 5 gallons, they will take those as long as they're a decent amount in good, usable condition, unless you have to, unless it's just bad in just getting rid of it. I think it may have been Barb, put a note saying that if you can dry it out, if it's latex, if you can dry it out, you can just harden it, leave the lid off, and put it in the dumpster. You can either use like kitty litter, or there is a kind of a substance that you can buy at paint stores that will harden it for you. You just stir it in. Any other thoughts? Anything that you thought of that wasn't necessarily represented by this site map that you could share and maybe help others with?
And Barb actually has another comment, and I love this because we have a video on how to build a Gradix box, and that's, they didn't paint their roofs or coat them in any way, but they created downspout boxes to filter the stormwater from the roof. And if you go to our website, the Washington Stormwater website, we have a YouTube channel called the Stormwater channel, And we have a video on how to build a downspout box. They're pretty easy to make, and they are quite effective. So thank you, Barb, for pointing that out. And Tamara has a question as well. She says, I'd heard there may be chemical issues with materials used for filling asphalt cracks. What comes to mind with me is it may be coal tar sealant, and that is highly toxic, and I believe it's banned in this state and a few other ones. Anne, do you have any other information about that?
No, not specifically. I know that Nathan has mentioned that if you're gonna seal your pavement, do it ASAP, because there's going to be kind of a kibosh on that in the near future.
A kibosh on doing your own?
Basically that they're gonna start, I think, testing some of the chemicals in that, or testing for some of the chemicals in it. So it would impact your stormwater, at least. Don't quote me on that, but I remember Nathan talking in something about that he was saying, do it sooner than later, because there's going to be a maybe possible violation issue in the near future.
I think I need more information on that. That sounds very interesting.
Yep.
And then I wanted to comment on that as well, the chemical issue for filling asphalt. There's also been issues with the material that's been used to seal catch basins and the concrete sections of the catch basins, and that has had PCBs in them. The city of Tacoma found that they did a source tracing and found that their caulking basically was contaminated, or not contaminated, but PCBs were a part of that formulation. So they had to remove it all and find another formulation.
Okay.
So I hope that answers your question, Tamara.
Okay, any other comments? Okay, well, thank you for playing along with this. I appreciate all the interaction and the comments and sharing. We're gonna go ahead and go on to the next slide, which I believe is
Excuse me.
a video, and I'm gonna let Lisa kind of take it for a minute.
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna turn on my video so you guys can see me just for a second. Hey, so the Washington Stormwater Center worked with a number of businesses in Tacoma to come up with this source tracing and evaluation video. Actually, they're not all in Tacoma, I take that back. But this is a really important issue, that if you are finding that you've gone through your whole facility, you've identified all those sources that you think you can either eliminate or have a BMP for, and you're still having issues, this gives you an idea of how to go about tracing those sources back to find out what is causing those problems in your stormwater. So Anne, can you go ahead and start the video? Welcome to the Washington Stormwater Center's video on tracing sources of invisible pollutants in stormwater runoff. This video will provide you with ideas on how you can successfully trace the sources of the pollutants regulated by the Industrial Stormwater General Permit that are often difficult to find and control, specifically zinc and copper. You should be aware of where these pollutants can be found at your facility so you can prevent them from getting into your stormwater. Identifying and removing these sources of pollution will save you from having to treat your stormwater, which can be quite costly. Let's start with zinc. This metal is found in many industrial equipment and materials. Anything that is galvanized is coated with a layer of zinc for corrosion prevention. Some common sources of galvanized materials include roofs, downspouts, and chain link fences. But don't forget about HVAC systems, slip-resistant metal ramps and scaffolding, barbed wire, and galvanized steel siding on buildings. And there are other sources of zinc that should not be overlooked, such as tires and tire dust, motor oil, wood preservatives, some paints, hydraulic fluid, zinc carbon dry cell batteries, moss killer, and even galvanized farm tubs used as decorative planters. Remember, the benchmark for zinc in Washington state is 117 parts per billion. Even small amounts can add up quickly to put you over that amount. You can control some sources of zinc by keeping materials inside a building or undercover, coating galvanized surfaces, keeping dumpsters closed, and sweeping paved surfaces regularly. But sometimes you need to look further. Associated Petroleum Products in Tacoma, Washington, thought they had their zinc pollution under control. They practiced diligent source control and even had a treatment system installed. But in 2013, their zinc sample numbers began to creep up.
First thing we did for source tracing was to sample from some downspouts that collects all the roof water. What I found in that is that the levels of zinc in the water were about at or just under our limits for zinc, which was kind of surprising considering most of the equipment had been checked on the roof and painted for galvanized surfaces. I think too that a lot of our issues with zinc very well have to do with the area that we're in, and things that get blown in from other properties land on our roof, collect in our rainwater, and then go down as part of our discharge off our property. Next, I took a look at the different catch basins around the property. I kind of started at the outside and kind of worked my way towards the treatment system. I tested a catch basin in the front part of our yard where it's near an area where our trucks called tank wagons park. When they come back into the yard after their shift, they have to make pretty tight turns to back into their parking spaces. So I figured that this was probably a tire dust, high percentage tire dust area. So I took some samples of a catch basin there and found that yes, it was a little bit high. It wasn't off the charts high, but yes, it was high. And even though we are doing sweeping every 2 weeks, I was still seeing that there probably was an accumulation of zinc in these cracks in this asphalt. I took a look at a particular catch basin in the back corner of the property, which happens to sit directly underneath the Puyallup River Bridge, and thought that that could be a culprit for some of the zinc issues that we see here too. So I sampled that catch basin, and sure enough, it was extremely high. So after doing testing of different catch basins and kind of working my way towards the system, I looked at the treatment system itself. I decided to do some inline sampling and found that the zinc levels were different in the different areas of the system, even after areas that should have been treating for zinc. So from the inline sampling and the different things I found, we upped the maintenance schedule. When every time we do a clean out of this, we seem to see those zinc levels go back down. So we definitely kicked up that schedule and now find ourselves doing it quarterly, cleaning out the entire system, which is a bit of an expense, but I feel it's completely worth it to ensure that we have the zinc levels where we want them to be.
While Associated Petroleum Products worked to identify their zinc sources, the Port of Seattle tackled pollution of their own. This time, the culprit was copper. At a regulated level of 14 parts per billion in Western Washington and 32 parts per billion in Eastern Washington, it's important to identify and reduce or remove, if possible, all sources. Vehicle brake pads, pesticides, marine anti-fouling paint, wood preservatives, copper piping, architectural components, air emissions, and roadway runoff are all sources of copper at industrial sites. Copper piping from sanitary sewer cross connections can also be a source. Even at extremely low levels, copper can affect fish and other aquatic life. The Port of Seattle was having an issue with copper levels at their Seaport Maintenance Facility. By doing extensive source control and tracking, they found that an average of 300 parts per billion copper was being deposited onto their property from the Alaska Way Viaduct. They suspected that their proximity to this major freeway was a source, so they built the Guzzler to find out.
We asked our maintenance folks to build what we call an innovative sampling structure called the Guzzler. And it's simply a roof with a trough attached to it, and that allows the water to drain off the roof, collect in a trough, and then hang the sampler at the end. And we actually hung the Guzzler up next to the viaduct itself and discovered that we had about 300 parts per billion of copper coming from the traffic that goes over the viaduct.
Even though the copper pollution isn't caused by the Port of Seattle, they still have to account for it on their property. Aggressive source control, such as frequent sweeping, keeping equipment under cover, and oyster shells in their catch basins for copper treatment, keep them in compliance. Although it's not invisible, turbidity or cloudiness of the water is also a concern. Turbidity is caused by sediment or dirt in the water. Heavy metals such as zinc and copper can enter stormwater by hitching a ride on the sediment and flow unseen into stormwater discharges. Turbidity is measured in nephelometric units, or NTUs. This is what 0, 25, 50, and 100 NTUs looks like in water. As you can see, it's hard to tell the difference. And don't forget, in Washington State, the benchmark is 25 NTUs. Sediment sources include tracking in from vehicles, erosion of soils from landscaping and construction activities, unpaved areas, and dust blown in from off-site. Turbidity can be prevented by frequent sweeping of paved areas, keeping bare soils and landscaped areas mulched or covered, and practicing proper erosion and sediment control of construction areas. Removing sediment from aging stormwater pipes in the city of Tacoma reduced the sources of pollution flowing into the ECOSS waterway. The ECOSS has been a working waterway since the 1860s. 120 years of heavy industrial and commercial uses in and around the water led to its contamination by a variety of pollutants.
In 1985, ECOSS Waterways was declared a Superfund site because of contaminated sediments. So Tacoma and its partners decided to clean up the waterway, and they invested $105 million to remediate the sediments within the waterway. We started a stormwater monitoring and source tracing program, and we've been monitoring the storm drains, both water quality and sediment. And we found that there were pollutants coming into the waterway still. And what we found is that we had these sediment traps that were located throughout the city, and these sediment traps showed that there were still some pollutants associated with sediment. So in order to remove these legacy pollutants that we think were getting resuspended and could possibly discharge back into our clean waterway, we wanted to make sure that we took care of those.
To protect the investment made to clean up the waterway, the City of Tacoma began an enhanced maintenance program. They enlisted their expert staff to focus on the ECOSS drainage area and began to thoroughly clean the stormwater infrastructure, some of which was 50 to 100 years old and had never been cleaned.
We knew we wanted to prevent any future loading into the ECOSS. So during the cleaning operation, the first thing we do is we want to block the line. So we have an inflatable balloon type structure that actually inflates inside the pipe and prevents any material or water moving down the line. The next step is we set up one of our Vector trucks, which is just like an oversized shop vac, essentially, is what you're really, if you're trying to visualize what it actually is. Once we have the line corked off, we set our Vector truck on that location. We actually use a jetter hose on the end of a cleaning head, and it actually uses high pressure water and brings the material down to a central location where that oversized shop vac actually is able to pick the material up out of the line. We take that material back down to our decant facility, which is where we allow the water to settle out a little bit further from the material so that we're actually just down to sediments. That material is then rolled in with some of our other street collected sediments and things. And with that, we were able to take the disposed waste to an approved disposal facility.
Whether you're just starting your stormwater management program or you've been at it for years, source tracing and evaluation can keep you in compliance and help you find and remove those invisible pollutants at your facility. Will save you from having to treat your stormwater. All right, thanks, Anne, so much. There was a question about whether or not, excuse me, there's a link to this video, and there is on our website. And I think we also will be providing in our resource list links to this video as well in all of our videos. But if you Google Washington Stormwater Center YouTube channel, all of our videos will come up. We've got some others that might be very interesting for you. All right, so, oh, Anne, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, are there any questions about the video? I actually have one comment. I realized that the Alaska Way Viaduct is no longer there, and I wonder how the Port of Seattle is doing in that area now. So I think I'm gonna follow up with them and see if they have had to continue with their vigorous maintenance and see where they're at.
Yeah, I was thinking that very thing as the video was streaming. So Are there any questions?
It again, and we're going to continue on our little SWIP journey. So the next part of the SWIP is sampling. Can you go to the next slide, Ann? Oh, there we go. Sorry. All right. So now that you have inspected your site, you've gotten rid of all the sources of pollution that you can find, you have to prove that what you've done is going to allow you to meet those benchmarks that are in the permit. So one of the things that we want to talk about is a sampling plan. So you have to know when to sample, where to sample, how to sample, and where to take your samples, which lab, and what to analyze for, and how to read those sampling results. All right, so sampling requirements. You have to sample at least once per quarter. And earlier, Anne was talking about that first fall flush. You need to note that when the new permit went into effect in January, they changed it to September 1st rather than October 1st. So don't forget to note that. And then you have to sample within 12 hours of discharge. And discharge means within 12 hours of the time that stormwater runoff leaves your property, leaves your facility. And it has to be representative of your facility's runoff. So you may have more than one sampling location. And if that is true, then remember to label those accordingly as sampling location 1, sampling location 2, etc. And then, so you need to obtain a representative sample, and all discharge points sample, unless substantially identical, must be sampled. So that's something that is talked more in depth at the classes that ECOSS puts on. But basically what it means is, I'm sorry, Barb sent a note as well that's very important. I'll get that out in a second. Thanks, Barb. So all the discharge points sampled, unless they're substantially identical. So what that means is, if you have an area where you do the exact same kind of industrial activity, you don't have to sample both of those locations. And then one of the things that Barb just brought up, and I think it's in the next slide, but I'll go ahead and talk about it, is you do not have to sample outside of your regular business hours. So if your discharge starts at midnight and you're not open at midnight, you don't have to sample until the start of your the shift when your business opens the next day. And then if the numeric effluent limits must be sampled if those parameters are applicable at your facility. That is also something that's talked about in the 101 class that ECOSS puts on, and it's a little complicated, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that right now. All right, so what is an accredited lab? There's a list of approved labs on Ecology's website, and it's important, I think, to create a relationship with them, to know who they are and what their expectations are. The holding times are important because there are certain analytical tests that you have to get your water in by a certain time within a certain window, and you need to verify that you're reading the zinc and copper levels in parts per billion and not parts per million, which is something that you need to talk to your lab about and make sure that they are reporting it to you in that parts per billion so you can read it correctly. Okay, so I thought we had a video that was coming up. Is that correct, Ian?
I think so. I'm not sure where it is though.
Okay, I apologize because I think we moved some slides around. So, all right, so here we go. So in this is our site map that we've been talking about for the last few hours. And on this map, there are 2 locations where runoff leaves the facility's property, and they are from 2 separate kinds of activities. So they both have to be sampled. actually 3, sorry about that. Catch basin number 1, where it leaves your property is where you would sample. And then from the oil water separator, you would sample it as that leaves your property as well. And then the last one, we talked about that wetland and how we want to make sure that your runoff isn't running into the wetland that is off your property, and that it's bermed, so your stormwater is bermed so that it goes into the catch basin. And so we need to make sure that that is happening. If it is not, if you have sheet flow that is going into that wetland, that would be another discharge point that you would need to sample. Okay, so we talked a little bit about benchmarks, but here are the basic sampling benchmarks that, that all permittees need to follow. So turbidity, again, it's in nephelometric units, and that is 25. And remember that 25, you can't even really tell that there's any sediment or turbidity in that water. So we need to be very careful about that. pH, that's how basic or acidic the water is. The benchmark for that is between 5 and 9. Oil and grease, there's no benchmark for that. It's just, can you see it in your catch basins or can you not? And that's sometimes a little bit of a tricky thing, but being honest about that, I think, is the best policy. And zinc, again, is 117 parts per billion. That's micrograms per liter. And copper, again, is that Western Washington 14 micrograms per liter or parts per billion, and Eastern Washington is 32. And then I want to mention that depending on your kind of industry, based on your, it's the NAICS code now, I think, not the SIC code, not this standard industrial code. I think they changed it with the permit that just came out. So you need to know what your codes are in order to ensure that you are sampling and checking for any pollutants that might be listed in your industrial code. Any questions about that? Looks like we have some questions. I'm actually gonna take a look at those questions now before we move on. Okay, let's see. Yep, okay. Oh, yeah, this is, okay. That is a good question. So Keith Gardner is asking, what happens when we have weather like the last few days where there's showers over 4 to 5 days? When does the 12 hours start? So if you don't, so if it rains like that, like it sprinkles a little bit and then it dries out, or we have showers and then no rain for a while, the 12 hours doesn't actually start until you have a discharge from your facility. So in other words, if the stormwater hits your pavement, but there's no discharge from where your sampling point is, if the water is not leaving your site, that is when the 12 hours start. I hope that makes sense. Okay, I guess that was it. Are there any other questions about that? I know that's a little bit tricky. Okay. Thank you. All right. So benchmark versus limit. So why the different terms and what do they mean? So a benchmark, a pollutant concentration, it's used as a threshold. And it's not necessarily, well, it's different from, well, okay, let me start. Let me back up. I apologize. It's considered unlikely to cause a water quality violation, but above that limit, it may cause a water quality violation. So if you have zinc above a benchmark of 117, it's not a violation of your permit, but if you don't do anything about it, that is the violation. So if you don't take a corrective action, which we'll go into in detail here in a few minutes, that is when the violation occurs. Now, a limit and a limit only applies to certain facilities. It is a permit violation. So if you have a limit of, I'm just going to make something up. If you have because the water body you're discharging into is so polluted that you have a discharge limit of 10 parts per billion of some pollutant. If you go over that, that is a permit violation. And it's based on the total maximum daily load. Again, that amount of pollution that a water body can handle without being polluted. It's very complicated. It's the 303D list of water bodies, and it has to do with the water bodies that you discharge into, not necessarily your facility or the kinds of activities you have on site. And that would be a violation of the water quality standards if you go over that limit. And is there anything else you want to say about that? You deal with TMDLs way more than I do, since you have much experience with the Duwamish waterway in particular. So is there anything you want to clarify or add to that?
No, I think you did fine.
Okay.
People need to know for sure if they are on a water body or discharged to a water body that has a TMDL, because it definitely impacts what your measurements are, because they can be lower than benchmarks.
Correct. Yeah. And so if you ever need help with that, you can contact Ann or me, and we can we can help walk you through that. Okay, so you do not need to sample outside of your regular business hours. And we talked about that from the question from Barb, but outside regular business hours does mean that if you have 3 shifts, you could possibly be required to sample during one of those. However, if it's unsafe conditions, like it's dark and you can't see and your discharge is in a slippery location where you might get hurt, you don't have to sample there or at that point. And during quarters where there's no discharge. So we kind of answered that as well. If you have an experience where there's, just showers and there's some rain, but it doesn't actually leave your facility, there's not enough rain to actually discharge, then you don't have to sample. But here's another caveat, is that you have to report your results, even the no discharge, by providing an electronic discharge monitoring report, which we'll also talk about a little later. But just remember that even if you don't have a discharge, you need to mark on your DMR, no discharge. And make sure that you're honest about that, because there are all kinds of ways that, that people can get access to precipitation data for your area. And if they think that there was a discharge, they may show up at your door. So, and then more sampling information. I think we're going to take a quick look at our sampling guidance document or sampling guidance video. Is it on the next slide? Yes, okay. Can you start that for us? Oh, before we start, there is a mistake in this, and so take a look for that, and let me know when you find it by chatting or putting it in the question and answer. Thank you.
This video is brought to you by the Washington Stormwater Center with support from the Boeing Corporation, the Washington State Department of Ecology, Washington State University, and Spectra Laboratories. In this video, we will show you how to sample stormwater for compliance with the Washington State Industrial Stormwater General Permit. We will show you what pollutants to sample for, contacting and discussing your needs with an accredited laboratory, gathering your sampling supplies and equipment, when and how often to sample, where to take a sample, how to sample at each type of discharge location, and what to do when you're done sampling. We'll start with what pollutants you need to sample for: turbidity or cloudiness of the water, pH, total zinc, and total copper concentrations. In addition, you must do a visual check for oil sheen. This is simply a yes or no and does not need to be analyzed by a lab. You may have additional pollutant types you need to sample for based on your industrial activities. Check the permit for those requirements. You'll need to contact a laboratory that is accredited by the Washington Department of Ecology. A list can be found on their website. Here's some things to discuss with the lab: type and size of collection bottle you will need for each sample, how full to fill each bottle, which bottles, if any, have acid preservative, safety concerns with any materials supplied by the lab, sample holding times or how long you have before the analysis must take place, and any forms you must fill out, such as the chain of custody. Make sure you have all your sampling supplies and equipment ready before your sampling event. This includes the bottles supplied by the lab, your cooler to hold samples on ice, disposable gloves such as nitrile, sampling notebook, preferably waterproof paper, pen, and pH paper. You may also want to consider rain gear and boots, and if needed, an extension pole for collecting water from a catch basin pipe. The Industrial Stormwater General Permit requires you to take a sample where stormwater from your industrial activities are discharged off-site. This could be from a pipe, such as a catch basin or outfall, an open ditch, or sheet flow. The samples must be taken where stormwater discharge is representative of all the pollution sources from industrial activities at your facility. These locations must be identified on your site map. For a more detailed description of this requirement, refer to your permit. Sampling must take place at least once per calendar quarter if there's a discharge of stormwater from your facility. Keep an eye on the forecast for your area to help you determine a good day to sample. Remember, you only have to sample during your business hours. Samples must be taken within 12 hours from the time the stormwater begins to discharge from your site. Let's take a look at how to sample at each type of discharge. Do not enter the catch basin or manhole. Be sure to wear clean gloves each time you take a sample. Be careful not to let the bottles touch the sides of the pipes. Take the sample from the pipe flowing from your facility, not from the basin itself, with the bottle facing upstream. Don't forget to take the pH of your stormwater while in the field. pH is a measure of how acidic or basic a substance is. This can be done with pH paper or a meter. Keep hands away from the bottle opening. Do not rinse or overfill sample bottles. Cap and label bottle with time and date, and place in cooler with ice. Record the result in your notebook. If your stormwater leaves your site through a ditch, you can sample there. Make sure the stormwater is only from your facility and does not mix with other stormwater from upstream. If the ditch is too shallow for the sample bottle, you can prepare a location by deepening it. Dig a depression deep enough for the bottle and line it with plastic. Make sure any sediment settles before you take your sample. Point the bottle upstream and fill to the desired level. If your facility doesn't have a concentrated flow of stormwater, such as a catch basin or outfall, you must take a sample of sheet flow where it leaves your site. In this case, the flow is too shallow for a bottle to be filled directly. Here's one way to take a sample of sheet flow. You'll need 2 small bags of sand, clean plastic sheeting, a quart-sized Ziploc bag, and a device to create a dam, such as a shovel handle or a 2x4. Place the plastic sheeting in the area where you will take the sample. Place the sandbags at an angle to each other, creating a funnel to concentrate the flow of stormwater. Don't forget to wear clean gloves. Using the Ziploc bag, collect the stormwater in the deepened area. Carefully pour the water into your sample bottle. Repeat as necessary to fill the container. Your sampling notebook should contain the date, time each sample was taken, and the weather conditions. In addition, note any irregularities at each site, such as strange odors, color of the water if out of the ordinary, or other abnormal conditions. When you finish sampling at all locations, take your samples to the lab. At the lab, you will fill out the chain of custody form to ensure that your samples are received in good condition. This form also informs the lab about what analyses you want to run. The lab will provide you with a copy for your records. The lab will contact you when your results are in. Now, reward yourself for a job well done.
Great, thank you. So that was our low budget fun sampling video. Did anybody catch the mistake in there? So one of the mistakes that we made is you're not supposed to take your pH paper and dip it into the sample bottle. What we should be doing is taking a separate sample and doing pH there. Okay, are there any questions about that? Okay, so the last thing from the SWIP is the SWIP certification form. And you need to sign the SWIP form when you initially create your SWIP, and then re-sign and I'll answer Barb's question in just a second, I'm so sorry. Re-sign and recertify every time you renew your permit, and each time you reach a corrective action and you take action for that benchmark exceedance. And make your adaptive management known to your staff and document it. So if you make changes to your SOPs or your BMPs, you need to make sure that you document those things in your SWIP, and that your staff, especially your pollution prevention team or your stormwater team, knows about those changes so they can make sure they make the right decisions when they are helping you with your stormwater management. There is a couple of questions. Yes, so a couple of questions about the pH. You can have the lab do the pH. However, if I remember correctly, the pH holding time is very, very short. So if you're going to take your pH sample to the lab, check with your lab to see what their holding time is and make sure you get it in within that time. Otherwise, it may not be valid. And then, yes, okay, so it's 14 minutes. I knew it was very short. And so it's best to actually do it in the field. You can run your turbidity with a turbidity meter if you have one, that's perfectly okay. But ecology says that you could also use pH paper. Any more questions about that? 14 minutes is not even enough time to like get to your car. So, so doing it in the field is a much better idea. And I think pH meters, a turbidity meter. I'm sorry. Can you also run your own turbidity? I missed that part. Oh, Spectra Labs across the street. That's awesome. Anne, can you answer the question about the turbidity meter? I think you can use your own meter for that.
Yeah, you can do turbidity and pH in the field. In fact, you should do pH in the field regardless, because after that time frame, any organics in the water can impact the pH. So you need to do it in the field. And it might be good to do both a meter as well as a pH stick, just to see if you can compare. We did a sampling thing yesterday, which was really fascinating, where we did a before a Gradix box and after, and it literally dropped an entire pH from like 8 to 7 and 7 to 6. Really fascinating.
Yeah, interesting.
And turbidity, yes. If you have a turbidity meter, by all means, do it in the field. That can also, depending on how long it takes, how cold you keep the samples and how long it takes you to get to the lab, that can also be impacted by organics in the sample.
Great, thank you, Anne. All right, so who can sign your SWIP? This is a federal requirement that the corporation vice president or higher, a sole proprietor can sign it, and the reporting forms that Ecology has, it's a, it says it could be a duly authorized person. So authorization has to be in writing and signed by one of the above folks, either a VP or higher, or a partner or a sole proprietor, the owner of the company. And the authorization specifies an individual or position as qualified. So if you are not the person that is going to be signing these, make sure that that person also knows what your adaptive management is, and and make sure they understand what they are signing, because they are the person responsible if anything should go wrong or is incomplete or not accurate on your SWIP certification. All right, so Anne is now going to talk. Are there any more questions about that? Okay, and Barb also made a note that calibration of the meters is really important, and that's true. So you want to calibrate it each time you use it. Okay, so if there's no more questions about the SWIP, the sampling or SWIP certification, I will let Anne talk about corrective actions. And this is sort of where the rubber meets the road for this permit.
Okay. All right, so you've gone over benchmark. Now what do you do? Just remembering that these are the benchmarks that you have to meet, and other possible pollutants depending on your industrial activity, as was referred to earlier by your NAICS code. So yeah, the first time you pass a benchmark or exceed a benchmark, and each time you exceed a benchmark, you have to do a level 1 operational source control BMP. So what that looks like is if you exceeded a benchmark value for any quarter during a calendar year, you have to complete a level 1 correction action within 14 days of receipt of sampling results or that indicate a benchmark exceeded for a given quarter, or for parameters other than pH and a visible oil sheen. You need to do that at the end of the quarter, whichever is later. So if you have a pH or oil sheen issue, you need to address that within 14 days. If it's other than that, you need to address it at the end of the quarter. Each time you need to sign and certify the SWIP on the discharge monitoring report or the DMR on the due date of the DMR. You want to conduct an initial inspection of your facility to investigate why there's been an exceedance. That may be similar to that source tracing video that we talked about earlier, finding out where the source of the materials are. You want to review your SWIP and ensure that you're complying with all the BMPs that you said you will apply. You want to make sure that there's appropriate revisions to the SWIP and include any additional operational BMPs that you might add to your list of activities that you do. Also, you want to summarize all the level 1 corrective actions that you take in the annual report. The deadline for that is, as we said, no later than the DMR due date for each quarter. So here's a couple examples of level 1 corrective actions, including increased sweeping. Some people have had to go to a monthly sweep from a quarterly sweep, depending on how much dust is coming onto your property and impacting your sampling. Also, you want to make sure that you clean up spills immediately. This is a list of your discharge monitoring report due dates. So February 15th, May 15th, August 15th, November 15th. That's when your DMRs are due. And your annual report is also May 15th. And then just while we're on this page, May 15th is when, if you have a level 3 engineering report due, that's also the May 15th due date. So just an FYI, we kind of refer May 15th as Stormwater Tax Day. Okay, so now you have the same benchmark exceedance twice in a year, 2 quarters in a year. So you have to implement some form of structural source control BMP. Here's an example. In 2018, you have 2 zinc exceedances. In 2019, you have 2 copper exceedances. You're not, I'll be talking about this in a minute, but you won't have to implement it until August of the next year for these things. So there is that time frame and lag. A couple of structural source control BMPs might be to put a cover over your materials or paint your roofs or your gutters or your siding. Each time you have an exceedance, you need to do a level 1 corrective action, regardless if it's the 2nd or 3rd time. Each time you have to do that. You want to review your SWIP and ensure that it's fully compliant with the permit conditions. You want to make appropriate revisions to the SWIP to include additional structural BMPs. So you've not only done the level 1 corrective action, which are operational BMPs, but you're doing a level 2 for structural source control. And sometimes it can take time. It's like if you have to build a structure, you may need the finances. You need to move things so that you can build it, those kinds of things. So you do have some time frame. The level 2 deadline, as I mentioned, is the permittee shall sign and certify the SWIP as soon as possible, but no later than August 31st of the following year. The final type of corrective action is level 3. And this is where you come into treatment BMPs. That means you've exceeded benchmark 3 quarters in a year, three out of 4 samples. So here's an example where you have turbidity and zinc in this year. So you're level 2 in 2018, but all of a sudden you have come into level 3 with zinc here. So a couple different types of treatment examples are enhanced biofiltration or a chitosan system. If you're interested in more treatment BMPs, we talk about that much more in our session 3 in our ECOSS webinars and 101. So with a level 3, again, you conduct a level 1 corrective action because every time you exceed, you need to do a level 1. You need to review the SWIP and ensure that it fully complies with the permit conditions. Make appropriate revisions to the SWIP to include the treatment BMPs, and you have to have an engineering report that goes along with that treatment BMP that you're planning on implementing. And you have to have a qualified industrial stormwater professional to review the SWIP and review the revised SWIP, sign the SWIP certification form, and certify that as reasonably expected to meet the ISGP benchmarks upon implementation. So that qualified person may be you as the person who's managing the permit, and most likely it's you. But there are other people that can assist you with that. So going over the deadlines again, level 1, you have to implement an operational BMP within 45 days after the end of the quarter. A level 2 is August 31st of the following year, and level 3 is September 30th of the following year. If you need a modification of coverage request, it needs to be in by May 15th. So for a waiver or an extension, a waiver because you can't afford it, it might be too costly for your business, or an extension because you need more time. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa to do reporting.
Okay, so I want to emphasize, as you can see, when you start exceeding those benchmarks, things get pretty complicated pretty quickly, and they also get very expensive very quickly. And so I just want to reiterate, like, don't wait, excuse me, until you exceed a benchmark before you start controlling those sources of pollution. Source control is the least expensive option. And I know there's some people on the call who know this very intimately, that it can get very expensive very quickly. So please, when you go back to your facilities, make sure that you're identifying all of those sources and eliminating them, or providing some kind of BMP or operational change to make sure that your runoff is as clean as it can be. So, you know, again, so complicated once we get to that point where you're exceeding benchmarks. And one other thing I want to reiterate, just because you exceed a benchmark does not mean that you're out of compliance with your permit. But if you don't take an action, if you don't take a level 1 or level 2 or level 3 action, you are out of compliance. Okay, so we'll talk about discharge monitoring reports in the annual report. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Anne. All right, so those discharge monitoring reports, it's that quarterly report that you have to file, and it's electronic. And so you have to go through a process where you get permission basically to sign those things electronically. So you need a SAW account, which is an account that basically is for all of the Washington state permits and even things like unemployment or that. You have to have a SAW account. Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. I apologize. So those due dates for the discharge monitoring reports. First quarter is May 15th, and that's also that stormwater tax day that Ann talked about, where sort of a lot of things are due. The second quarter due date is August 15th. Thank you, Secure Access Washington. Yes, thank you. I was looking for that, that acronym. Okay, sorry. Third quarter is November 15th, and the fourth quarter is then February 15th of the following year. And so as you can see, they're due 45 days after the end of each quarter. You have to report whether or not you discharge any runoff. So again, remember what I was talking about, even if you have no discharge, you have to file the report and check the box that says no discharge. And again, it must be submitted electronically. Okay, so that annual report that is due, so we have quarterly reports to talk about your benchmarks, and then you have your May 15th of each year, you have an annual report, and that includes all of the benchmarks that you exceeded, the stormwater problems that you identified, and how you fixed them, and those corrective actions taken. So if you changed your sweeping to from once a month to every 2 weeks, you mark that on your annual report. That would be a good example of that. And again, that must be submitted electronically. So on that May 15th, you're going to be doing your quarterly report as well as this annual report. All right, so enforcement. And do you want to talk about enforcement, or is this me? I apologize for not knowing. Okay, I think it's me. All right, so let's talk about ecology enforcement or civil lawsuits, just briefly. An absence of information opens you up for exposure to enforcement and civil lawsuits. So make sure that what you submit to ecology in those DMRs and your annual reports is accurate and correct. And you can check that by going to the Paris database website. This is where all of your information goes. And it's a public database. And so anybody can go and look at this database, look up your facility and see what you are doing to ensure that you're in compliance with your permit. And so what you want to do is make sure that if there is any problems, if the Paris database is incorrect in any way, you should talk to ecology immediately and say, this is incorrect, we need it to be changed. And so it's a little bit of just due diligence, advocating for yourself to make sure that what you're presenting to them is what actually ends up on the website. And document, you need to make sure it's just like taxes. Document everything you do, how you do it, keep all of those records, and make sure, again, that you are reporting correctly to ecology. All right, so permit violations can lead to civil or criminal enforcement actions by ecology and citizen groups under the Clean Water Act. So let's talk about the Clean Water Act really quickly. It's not something you want to read in its entirety, but one of the most important things you need to know is that there is a provision in the Clean Water Act that allows for third-party citizen groups to sue if they find that you are not in compliance with your permit. And those lawsuits can get extremely expensive, and you do not want to get into that position. So if you can stay out of that, that would be good. Those citizen groups, it's any permit violations subject to the suits, record keeping and reporting, I've seen those, failure to self-report those violations, and if you don't send in a notice of intent. So if you are a facility that has an industrial code that requires you get a permit and you don't have a permit, you need to send in a notice of intent. So you need, yes, wait, I am getting that mixed up. I apologize. Let me step back. So, Anne, can you rescue me for a second? I apologize. I got off on a little bit of a tangent.
No worries. There's two types of notices of intent. One
That's
is
right. Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so there's two types of notices of intent. So the notice of intent that's talked about here is the notice that you get from the third-party citizen group telling you that they will be suing you within 60 days if you don't take certain actions. So that is different, very different from your notice of intent where you actually apply for the permit. Does that make sense? Ian, do you have anything to add to that? I know that's a lot of information.
No, you did good.
Okay, all right. Are there any questions about that? I don't see any in the chat box right now, but if you have any questions, let me know. You know, just let me reiterate, I have seen, it was a boatyard in Tacoma. It was the cleanest boatyard I've ever seen. You could have eaten off the floor. And they had some record keeping and reporting snafus, and they got a 60-day notice of intent to sue. So be aware that that every part of your permit is important, and not just your sampling and your corrective actions, that you need to take action to make sure that you're documenting all of those things that are required. Okay, all right, so let's talk a little bit about the resources that we have for you. Okay, so the water quality web portal that Tanya Wolf at Ecology, God forbid that woman ever retire, because she is a wealth of knowledge. If you don't have the permit and you need it, she can help walk you through how to get the permit. It's a bit complicated, and she is the best resource I think that Ecology has. No offense to anybody on here that, no, there's no regulators on the line. Anyway, so just know that she is so helpful and always willing to help. So that's her phone number and her email. Yes, she is a lifesaver. Yes, definitely. All right, so the Ecology permit managers, you can see here, I think this is current, and I know that Ecology is still closed, or the buildings are closed, but people are still working from home, and so it may be a little bit more difficult to get a hold of them, but this is the information on how to get a hold of them. And I think Ecology has actually been pretty good about sending automatic notices. So if you email them, you should get an email back saying, I'm not working from the office, I am working from home, and I will get to you as soon as possible. And they may give you a cell number or some other way to get a hold of them. Barb, thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. I think Josh is in Thurston County. So Josh Klimek, we will check that. Thank you very much. Yes, I will check that. And then Travis Porter is the permit writer, and he is also very helpful. He is, again, at Ecology, he's working from home. So if you try to get a hold of him and you can't, just keep trying. And he's a wealth of knowledge as well, because he wrote the permit. All right. And then I'm gonna let Anne talk about this. This is a great resource from ECOSS. So this has been sort of the basic building blocks that we've been talking about today, and it will be available online as a webinar. It's free, and then there's more in-depth webinars and workshops in person when we can that ECOSS does with another company. So go ahead, Anne. I'm sorry I took up so much time.
No worries. All right, so yeah, this is the first year we've done the basic building blocks. We've done it once in person and once on a webinar. So please give us your feedback in the evaluations, because it's really helpful, and we haven't had a lot of feedback. We've only had one class to compare it with. So any kind of information or feedback you can provide would be greatly appreciated. Recently, because of the COVID, we decided to take our one-on-one series online, and we created 4 webinars from it. And so we will be hosting those webinars for a fee. And I'll be sending that information out to permit managers in the near future. We also have a, well, actually the session 4 of that webinar is kind of a combination of 201 and a little bit of 101. We cover letters of intent or notices of intent to sue with a lawyer who manages those types of things. And we also cover a lot of, you have a level 3 action to take. So now what? So it's a pretty broad spectrum of information, much more in depth than we got into today. And I think it's really helpful. People return again and again to take those classes. We also try to put on a 201. It's hard to do if it's not in person. So we're not sure if we're going to be doing that this year, but we look at case studies and kind of share those case studies. Sometimes we also bring in stormwater professionals to give case studies from their business. And so it's really helpful to be able to speak to them one-on-one and get some contact there. This is the evaluation. I'm going to have Lauren put it in the chat for you to respond to if she hasn't already. And I will also send a link out so you can respond to that evaluation. Once you've responded to the evaluation, we'll send you a resource link that will have all sorts of information, including the permit, guidance documents, forms, etc., which is a really valuable tool for you to meet your compliance needs. All right. We'll go ahead at this point and open things up to Q&A. Does anybody have any questions?
Or comments.
Or comments.
And there's, yeah, this is our information. Please do contact us. My work number is on there. I just realized I'm going to give you my cell number now if anybody wants to contact me directly. So that number, actually, I'll put that in the chat as well because I'm working from home. Our campus is still closed.
Yeah, the same with me. I'm working well, so I'll put my cell number in the chat. So it does not appear to be any questions. Oh, great presentation. Thank you, Barb. Numbers on the different maps, they did not show up.
Oh, okay.
Huh, okay. Sorry about that, Keith. Great feedback though, I appreciate that.
Yeah, definitely. And, please know that, I'm not making excuses for for myself, but this is the first time I've ever done anything like this. And it's hard, I think, to not be able to see people and have visual cues and know that we're on the right track. So thank you so much for bearing with us and keeping up in there and for participating in the discussions as well.
Yes. Yeah. If there are no other questions at this time, we want to just acknowledge and thank you for your participation today. What we will send out a link to the presentation so you can review it and or share it. We will also provide information about ECOSS's classes if you are interested in purchasing access to those. And also, when you do the evaluation, if you could please, any feedback, any comments, like the idea that there was no numbers on the maps. Great feedback, first time doing this, so really helpful for any even little information like that to make the experience better next time. So thank you so much. And please feel free to reach out if you have any questions after the class. We're here as resources and we look forward to hearing from you. Take care.
Bye, thank you.